Good evening, I'm Glenda Chong and tonight's top stories. Anger and anxiety as Japan begins releasing treated radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The move sparking protests across the region, with China banning all Japanese seafood imports. The three men vying to become the next head of state deliver their campaign messages on the first presidential candidate broadcast. Mr. Ng Kok Song, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Mr. Tan Kin Lian also keeping up with outreach efforts. They share how they are funding their campaigns. And also tonight, school bus fares look set to rise by up to 13% next year. Operators have been given the green light to increase the pricing cap to cover rising costs. China has retaliated against Japan, slapping a blanket ban on Japanese seafood imports. It fears contamination from treated radioactive water, which Tokyo began releasing today from the wrecked Fukushima nuclear plant, and thus despite the International Atomic Energy Agency giving the all-clear for Japan to proceed with its plan. China was the biggest buyer of Japanese seafood last year, worth $600 million. Beijing slams the disposal of the water as extremely selfish and irresponsible. And it adds that this is a major safety issue with cross-border implications, not just a private matter for Japan alone. Beijing says it has lodged solemn representations with Tokyo.
日方强行启动核污染水排海，公然向全世界转嫁核污染风险。 这是极端自私、极不负责任的错误行为。所有的利益攸关方都有权利、有责任采取必要的防范措施，维护海洋环境安全，维护食品安全和公众健康。
There's also been protests in South Korea. Police arrested at least 14 people who stormed a building housing the Japanese embassy in Seoul. South Korea is maintaining import bans on Fukushima fisheries and food products until public concerns are eased. Japan's plan also facing criticism at home. Local fishing groups continued to voice their opposition on concern about damage to the reputation of their seafood. And back here in Singapore, some restaurants and supermarkets selling Japanese products have received concerns from their customers. Authorities had said they are closely monitoring imports from there and have found that these are safe for consumption. Supermarkets like this tell CNA they are worried this could affect their customers' perception of imported goods. It is already expecting up to 10% fewer customers next month. Restaurants say their supply of seafood is not affected and they have no plans to stop putting raw fish, for example, on the menu.
The consumer side always worry about safetyness of food, so that's why I think from now on I have more encounter customer to ask me the food is bad or food is healthy or this kind of issue.
Earlier this month, Sustainability and the Environment Minister, Grace Fu, said Japan's plan is unlikely to impact the seawater quality in and around Singapore. Authorities will continue to monitor radiation levels in the country's food imports. Mr. Ng Kok Song says the time has come for the elected president to be non-partisan. In his presidential candidate broadcast message, he notes that past elected heads of state have been affiliated to or been endorsed by the ruling People's Action Party.
I strongly believe that the time has come for the elected president to be non-partisan. In other words, a president who has not belonged to any political party and a president who is not endorsed by any political party. The president should be independent of any political party so that the president can exercise the important responsibilities without fear or favor.
He adds that Singapore can no longer take for granted that it will always have a good and honest government, and there is a need for an external check. Calling the president as the symbol of unity for Singaporeans, he is advocating for what he calls do well, do right, and do good for Singaporeans. To do well is to have a resilient mind and body. To do right is to live by a code of integrity.
To do good is to build a more caring and kinder society. Over the years, I've advocated for and contributed to palliative care, the disability sector, children's charities, and animal welfare groups. I pledge to give my voice to the youth, to the elderly, and to the vulnerable communities so that no one may be left behind in Singapore's progress.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam says that as Singapore becomes a democracy with more diverse views, the challenge is to ensure that it doesn't lead to a more divided society. He says the world is moving into an increasingly divided and unstable era, and this will test countries, especially smaller ones like Singapore. Mr. Tharman made these comments in his presidential candidate broadcast message.
Our real challenge as Singaporeans is to ensure that this diversity of views does not lead us to a more divided society, like many others. We must be a democracy with more space for different views and a thriving civil society. But to be confident of our future, we must also be a society with a strong centre of shared aspirations and respect for all citizens.
If elected, Mr. Tharman wants to strengthen that culture of respect for all Singaporeans. He will also build on his international standing to promote Singapore's interests on the world stage. Mr. Tharman says he will also ensure there is prudent use of the country's reserves and that Singapore has an honest and first-rate public service.
Through my many years in government as a minister, I've held on to my ideals of social justice and inclusiveness and worked continually, year after year, to build consensus on practical and sustainable ways to uplift workers' and ordinary citizens' lives. While the President stands apart from the government and does not make policies, I will never waver from this purpose in my life and independence of mind as I fulfill my duties.
Mr. Tan Ken Lian says he doesn't intend to be an adversary to the elected government. On the contrary, he hopes to collaborate with the government to achieve key presidential duties.
It is vitally important that the reserves are invested soundly to produce a good rate of return over the long term, covering 5 years or longer, and is not exposed to high risk. Apart from ensuring that the past reserves are invested prudently, I intend to work with the government to ensure that the past reserves are used wisely for the benefit of our current and future generations.
Mr. Tan says it's also important to have the right people at the top levels of public service. Those with on-the-job knowledge and those on the ground, as well as scholars, should be valued.
We need different types of people, those with talents and those with practical experience, to form a good team. I wish to see that the people who have gained knowledge and practical experience from many years of dedicated service are given the opportunity to advance to positions of leadership.
Calling it his vision to build a nation where people are united and live in harmony, Mr. Tan says he believes people will be united when they feel financially secure and thus able to think about the greater good of society. And if you missed the first presidential candidate broadcast on CNA TV and radio, you can catch it after the news at 9:30 p.m. right here on Channel 5. And still ahead on News Tonight, the Elections Department apologizes after nearly 10,000 votes received 2 poll cards due to an error. Plus,
hi, I'm Stephen Chow. Join me and my guest tonight as we discuss housing affordability. That's coming up after the bulletin.
My Mitsubishi Electric StarMax aircon saves me energy and money. It's easy to clean and is so quiet.
You have regional aspirations across ASEAN and Greater.
The Infocom Media Development Authority has removed parts of Mr. Tan Kin Lian's original televised campaign speech as it contained inaccuracies about the president's role. Ahead of the recording, IMDA asked the presidential candidate to correct some of his original script. It said Mr. Tan's election agent had corrected them without objection. During his walkabout at Senja this morning, Mr. Tan said he disagreed with IMDA's decision but complied because of a deadline.
I consider these statements to be the most important part of my speech. I consider the IMDA does not have the authority to interpret the Constitution in their way, and ask for the statements to be removed. I did not have time to argue about that. I removed this statement and I will deal with IMDA separately.
Mr. Tan also claimed the preparations for the televised speech were, quote, very rushed. But in a joint statement, the Elections Department and IMDA said candidates were informed of the presidential candidate broadcast timings and rules on 12 August and were also briefed on 21st August. Both agencies said all candidates signed a statutory declaration on their nomination paper confirming that they have read the material that explains the president's constitutional role. And they added that all candidates have also signed a voluntary undertaking to campaign for the election in a manner befitting a president's position. They remind them not to mislead the public about the president's role. The three presidential candidates continued their outreach efforts on the third day of campaigning, where the issue of funding was raised. Now, each of the candidates can spend up to $812,000 under conditions set by the Presidential Elections Act. So that works out to a maximum of 30 cents for each of the 2.7 million eligible voters. Mr. Ng Kok Song, who was at Ghim Moh Market and Food Centre, where he interacted with stallholders and patrons, he told the media that his campaign funding will come from his personal savings.
I've decided not to accept any donations, either financial donations or donations in kind, because I do not want to be beholden to anyone in standing for the presidency. There were some well-wishers who offered to help finance my campaign. I have respectfully declined their offers.
Mr. Tan Kin Lian was at a hawker centre in Senja. He said he intends to run a frugal campaign which will largely be self-funded. And he added that he's appreciative of the donations received so far.
I'm funding this on my own. How much will I spend? I think it should be less than $100,000. But it is still a large sum of money to a retired person. I want to thank a few people who responded to the fundraising. Most of my donations are for $10, $20, some are $100. There are a few $1,000 donations.
Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam's team says they have complied with all regulations and guidelines in response to CNA's query about how he's funding his campaign. He was at Lau Pa Sat as part of his community outreach, which he says is very different from the political walkabouts he used to do.
General elections, of course, are very different because you visit people in their homes as well, and I've always made that a point to meet people at home. When it comes to presidential elections, you can't visit people at home all around the island. So meeting them at the hotspots like hawker centres and markets, and also organising dialogues with different groups. has been extremely rewarding and very, very engaging, I would say.
Police have approved an application by Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam for an election meeting. He is the first candidate of his presidential election to have his meeting application approved. The indoor event will be held tomorrow at the Pasir Panjang Power Station from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Entry is restricted to people who registered with the organizer. Police put out an advisory earlier this month that permits are required for all election meetings after candidates have secured permission from the venue owners. Presidential candidate Tharman Shanmugaratnam is a familiar face to Singapore, having spent more than 20 years in politics. The 66-year-old former senior minister wants to be Singapore's president for a new era and has called for a dignified contest. Tan Tze Hui with more on the man in the second of a three-part series on the country's 3 presidential candidates.
Student activism played a big role in Mr. Tharman's early days studying in the UK. And it was also in the UK where he met his wife, Jane Itogi, another important milestone in his life.
And eventually got married. Very simple marriage. We first went to a Hindu temple for a very basic ceremony on the way to the registry of marriages, and my mother was with us. Then, of course, we were keen on children. So we did a bit of research and found that there was this tribe called the Yoruba tribe in Africa, which had lots of twins, incredible fertility, and they ate a lot of yam. So my wife being Teochew, we decided we're going to go to every restaurant that has orni. Didn't know whether it was the husband who needs to eat orni or the wife. So we both whacked. Lo and behold, we had 4 children in quick succession.
And the most rewarding part, serving residents for 22 years. If elected as president, he says he won't change his style or personality.
I will continue to be who I am. I intend to be on the ground supporting initiatives, supporting civil society. I intend to be personal in the way I go about my work.
Now, if you were elected as president, what would be your process if you disagreed with the government of the day?
If it's the constitutional role of the president to exercise judgment and make a decision, that's of course something that I'll do scrupulously and with the independence of mind that everyone knows. So I will exercise that role responsibly in Singapore's interests. If it's issues that are not part of the constitutional role of the president, the custodial powers that the president has, then the correct way of going about it is to meet the Prime Minister privately and provide my own advice, independent advice. If you have a relationship of trust and mutual respect between the Prime Minister and the President, there's a greater likelihood of that advice being taken seriously.
Mr. Tharman says his experience in government and politics over the years will help him fulfill responsibilities of the presidency, such as safeguarding the reserves.
They've been invaluable 22 plus years, invaluable.
Mr. Tharman first burst into the scene in 2001 when he entered politics with the People's Action Party. He was then elected as an MP for Jurong GRC. 2 years later, he took the helm at the Education Ministry before taking the finance portfolio in 2007. He then served as Deputy Prime Minister in 2011 to 2019 and held prominent posts at international organizations, including the International Monetary Fund and World Economic Forum.
Coming up on News Tonight, now do you have children who take the school bus? Expect to pay more next year as fares are set to rise again.
Weather Report brought to you by Mitsubishi Electric.
Come join the many people who have taken their first step to...
The Elections Department has apologized for causing confusion after some 9,800 voters in Tanjong Pagar GRC were erroneously sent 2 poll cards for the upcoming presidential election. And this was due to a mistake by the printers. ELD says it's reaching out to affected voters to inform them of the correct poll card to use for voting next week. ELD says the printer, Topan, had sent out test prints of the poll cards together with the correct ones to these voters. More than 9,300 of them received 2 poll cards with different serial numbers. The rest had 2 cards with the same information. The affected voters are those who are assigned to vote at St. Margaret's School, Tanglin Community Centre, Farrer Park Primary School and Delta Sports Hall. ELD says voters can get the correct details from their e-poll card on SingPass. It assures Singaporeans that there are processes in place to ensure that those with 2 poll cards can only vote once. And they need to produce their NRIC, which will be verified against the polling station register at the polling station. The Elections Department will also deploy more sensitive electronic registration devices at polling stations in the upcoming presidential election. And that's after it was informed by some 200 Singaporeans that they did not receive their poll cards despite voting at the general election in 2020. Based on preliminary checks, the ELD says the identification cards of some voters may not have been properly scanned by the registration devices at polling stations during GE 2020. As such, some voter attendance data may not have been captured in the system. But the ELD says voters were informed to check on their voting status prior to every election. ELD says it cannot restore the affected citizens to the voters list for this presidential election, but to rectify this, it will contact them to restore their names once they've been verified. And these people will then be able to vote at future elections. A TikTok user was issued a correction direction under Singapore's fake news law for a post regarding public housing policies. Dr. Ishak J had falsely claimed that the HDB prices and sells new flats to make a profit. The National Development Ministry says new flats are priced with the objective of keeping public housing affordable. The amount collected from the sale of HDB flats every financial year is less than the total development costs. The ministry also clarified other false claims the user made about the cost of public flats. Dr. Ishak J must create a new TikTok post with a correction notice stating he made a false statement. He must also provide a link to the government's clarification. This is the 3rd time within a week that Dr. Ishak J has received a correction order. The first and second instance was over voter secrecy and the Central Provident Fund. Parents who rely on school buses to send their children to school could pay up to 13% more in fares next year. The Education Ministry has given the green light to operators for a price hike. The higher pricing cap in existing contracts is aimed at covering rising costs. MOE says the hike will minimize the risk of disruptions and inconvenience to families should operators be unable to sustain services. Operators will inform parents of any fare change from September. The pricing cap was last adjusted by 7% in January this year. One parent is paying close to $300 a month for a service that sends his primary 2 son to and from Nanyang Primary School. He'll continue with the bus service for now despite the price hike, and that's to avoid the 45-minute traffic jam near the school.
I guess the psychological threshold is like, when it reaches 500, then probably Grab may be an option. There are certainly some options out there, but if it's 13%, so be it. But if it comes to 500, then probably there may be some discussions that we need to have.
Meanwhile, school bus operators say the fare hike will help to defray some of the rising operational costs, but that it's not enough. And that's because fuel prices, insurance and wages have gone up by between 20 and 50% in the past 12 months. And that's news tonight. The presidential candidate broadcast will be up next, followed by Talking Point. Have a good evening.
This program is available on demand for free